I woke up expecting another long day of struggle, another reminder of how alone I was in this world. Instead, I woke up to a woman I never imagined would be in my home wearing my shirt and holding a truth that would stop my life in its tracks. People think life-changing moments arrive with warning signs or dramatic build-up. But sometimes they arrive quietly in the morning light when you are still half asleep and unprepared. This is not a story about romance or scandal. This is a story about dignity, fatherhood, assumptions, and the power of being truly seen. I am a black single father who learned in one moment how quickly judgment falls and how deeply truth can heal. From the moment I became a black single father, I learned that assumptions arrive before introductions and judgments walk into the room long before conversations do. People did not ask my story, they filled in the blanks for me with narratives that made sense to them, and those narratives were rarely kind. They assumed I was absent before I ever showed up, they assumed I was careless before they saw my calendar, and they assumed my life was unstable before they ever stepped inside my home. And that kind of assumption settles on you like a second skin, invisible to others but heavy enough to feel every day. I could see it in the way people looked at me when I mentioned my children alone in waiting rooms and school offices. Their eyebrows would lift just a little, their tone would shift into something careful, something curious, something edged with doubt, as if they were searching for the missing part of the story, the mother, the explanation, the mistake. And when they did not find it in my words, they created it in their minds, because society is more comfortable with a familiar stereotype than with a man who quietly defies it. There were questions that sounded innocent but carried weight, questions about how I managed work and parenting, questions about whether I had help, questions about how long it had been just me and the kids, and each question carried an unspoken verdict, as if they were measuring my answers against an invisible standard I had never agreed to. And the truth was, I managed because I had to. I showed up because my children needed me, and I did it without fanfare, because survival does not always leave room for explanation. People assumed my household was chaotic, that meals were rushed, that emotions were neglected, that love was inconsistent, because they could not imagine tenderness and structure coming from a man like me. They saw my skin before they saw my schedule, they saw my status before they saw my discipline, and they saw my exhaustion before they saw my devotion. And what hurt most was not the judgment itself, but the way it erased my effort, as if everything I did counted less because it did not fit their expectations. At school meetings, I noticed how teachers would speak more slowly to me, how they would over-explain routines or policies as if I were unfamiliar with them, as if I had not already read every email, memorized every schedule, and prepared every question in advance. They did not know that I stayed up late researching school programs, or that I rehearsed conversations in my head to make sure I advocated for my children calmly and clearly, because I knew I would be scrutinized more closely than other parents, and that awareness shaped how I moved through the world. In public spaces, I felt the double weight of being seen and unseen, seen as a potential problem, unseen as a capable caregiver, and that contradiction is exhausting because it requires constant vigilance. You learn to soften your voice, to keep your hands visible, to smile even when you are tired, because you know any misstep could confirm someone else's prejudice, and that pressure does not disappear when you go home, it follows you into quiet moments when you question whether you are doing enough, or whether the world will ever allow you to simply exist without explanation. What people did not see were the details that make a life stable: the color-coded calendars on the fridge, the notes on my phone reminding me of school projects and doctor appointments, the routines that kept our days predictable and our nights calm. They did not see the bedtime rituals, the stories read twice because they were requested twice, or the way I learned to braid hair, watch cooking videos, and pack lunches that balanced nutrition with preference, because my children deserved care, not excuses. Assumptions also crept into professional spaces. Colleagues would express surprise when I was organized, when I met deadlines, when I spoke thoughtfully in meetings, as if competence was unexpected coming from someone with my background and responsibilities. And those moments were subtle, but they accumulated. Each raised eyebrow, each backhanded compliment, each comment that framed my reliability as remarkable rather than normal. And over time you start to feel like you are constantly auditioning for respect in rooms where others are simply assumed to belong. There were days when the weight of those assumptions pressed down hard, when I wondered if it would be easier to explain myself less, to shrink my life to fit what people expected rather than constantly pushing against it. But then I would come home to my children, who knew me not as a stereotype but as their father, the man who showed up every day, who listened, who corrected, who comforted, and who loved without condition. And their trust became my anchor, because it reminded me that truth does not require universal approval to be valid. I learned that assumptions thrive in distance, they grow in the absence of relationship, and they persist when people do not have to confront the humanity of the person they are judging. And as a black single dad, I often became a symbol rather than an individual, a cautionary tale rather than a committed parent, and that realization was painful, but it also sharpened my understanding of the world. I began to see how easily people reduce complex lives to simple narratives, and how important it is to resist internalizing those reductions. There were moments of quiet defiance when I chose not to correct assumptions because my energy was better spent elsewhere. Not every misunderstanding deserves your explanation, and not every judgment deserves your response. Sometimes the most powerful answer is consistency, the steady repetition of showing up, doing the work, and loving well even when no one is watching, because over time reality speaks louder than rumor and character outlasts stereotype. Still, the cost of carrying those assumptions was real. It showed up in the fatigue that went beyond physical tiredness, a fatigue rooted in always being on guard, always anticipating misunderstanding, and always feeling like you had to prove your worth twice over. And acknowledging that cost mattered, because pretending it did not exist would have been another form of silence, another way of allowing the narrative to go unchallenged inside myself. What sustained me was the knowledge that my children were watching. They were learning not just from what I said but from how I handled being misjudged. They were learning resilience, grace, and self-respect by observing how I moved through a world that did not always make space for me, and that awareness gave my struggle meaning beyond myself. It turned endurance into example. Assumptions followed me, but they did not define me. They were external noise, not internal truth, and I learned to separate the two by grounding myself in what I knew to be real: my commitment, my consistency, and my love for my children. That grounding became my shield against doubt, and my reminder that I did not need to live up to anyone else's story to live honorably. In time I understood that assumptions say more about the people who hold them than about the person they are placed upon, and while that understanding did not erase the impact, it helped me carry it with less weight, because it reframed the struggle as a reflection of societal blind spots rather than personal failure, and that shift in perspective was liberating. Being a black single dad meant walking through a world that often misread me, but it also meant having the opportunity to quietly rewrite the narrative through my daily choices. And while I could not control how quickly others learned, I could control how faithfully I lived, and that commitment to authenticity became my quiet resistance and my deepest source of pride, because even when assumptions arrived before my name, my actions spoke long after, and they told a story that did not need anyone else's permission to be true. Strength is often imagined as something dramatic, loud, and unmistakable, like triumph announced from a stage or power exercised through authority, but the kind of strength that held my life together did not look like that at all. It looked ordinary. It blended into routines and responsibilities so seamlessly that most people never noticed it, and yet it was the force that carried me through each day as a black single father, balancing love, labor, and loss without an audience. Every morning began before the sun, not because I was chasing success but because the day demanded it. Alarms went off, lunches were packed, clothes were laid out, and small voices called my name before my feet even touched the floor. There was no one to pass the responsibility to, no shared glance across the kitchen, no quiet negotiation about who would handle what. There was only me and the understanding that my children relied on my consistency more than my words, and that awareness shaped every decision I made. From the outside it probably looked unremarkable: a man dropping kids off at school, heading to work, returning home in the evening, cooking dinner, helping with homework, and preparing for the next day. But inside that routine was a constant negotiation of time, energy, and emotion. I learned to move efficiently, not out of ambition but out of necessity. Every task had a purpose, every moment had weight, because wasted time meant unfinished responsibilities, and unfinished responsibilities carried consequences for children who deserved stability. I learned to be gentle and firm in the same breath, to correct behavior while preserving trust, to set boundaries without crushing curiosity, and to discipline in ways that taught rather than shamed. That balance required patience and self-control, especially on days when exhaustion blurred my edges and the temptation to withdraw was strong. But I could not afford to disappear emotionally even when I felt drained, because my children needed presence, not perfection. There were nights when I sat alone after they fell asleep, staring at the quiet house, feeling the full weight of what I carried, and in those moments strength did not feel heroic. It felt heavy. It felt like choosing to stand up again the next morning even when no one would notice the effort. And that kind of strength is invisible to the world because it leaves no spectacle behind, only continuity, and continuity is easy to take for granted when you are not responsible for maintaining it. At work I moved through my responsibilities with the same quiet discipline I practiced at home. I did not have the luxury of being disorganized or unreliable because too many people depended on me, and while others could recover from a bad day with help or understanding, my margin for error was thinner, and that awareness kept me focused but also isolated because it left little room for vulnerability or explanation. I learned to carry my stress silently because there was always more to do. People often praise single parents for being strong, but that praise can feel hollow when it does not come with understanding, because strength in this context is not a personality trait, it is a response to circumstance. It is what happens when there is no alternative, and while I appreciated acknowledgement, I also resented the implication that this strength was somehow exceptional rather than necessary, because framing it as exceptional made it easier for people to ignore the systems and assumptions that made it necessary in the first place. The strength I practiced was not about doing everything alone out of pride, it was about doing what had to be done without collapsing under the weight of it, and that required learning when to rest in small ways, when to accept help without shame, and when to forgive myself for not meeting every imagined standard. I learned that strength includes self-compassion even when the world expects stoicism, because without compassion resilience turns into bitterness. There were moments when my children tested me, when patience ran thin and frustration threatened to spill over, and in those moments strength meant pausing rather than reacting, choosing words carefully and remembering that they were not obstacles to my goals, they were the reason for them, and that reframing helped me show up with grace even when I felt stretched beyond my limits. I also learned to find strength in predictability. Routines became anchors in our home: meals at the same time, bedtime at the same hour, weekend rituals that created a sense of safety and belonging for my children, and those routines did more than organize our days, they communicated reliability, and reliability is a form of love that often goes unnoticed because it lacks drama, but its impact is profound. What people did not see was the emotional labor involved in being both nurturer and provider, the constant switching between roles, the mental load of remembering every detail, and the quiet worry that accompanied every decision, and yet I carried it because love demanded it and because my children's well-being mattered more than my comfort. Strength also meant confronting my own limitations, acknowledging when I was overwhelmed and seeking growth rather than denial. I read books, listened to advice, and reflected on my parenting, not because I was insecure but because I was committed to being better than my circumstances, and that commitment fueled my endurance on days when motivation was low. There were times when loneliness crept in, when the house felt too quiet after bedtime and the absence of adult conversation weighed heavily, and in those moments strength meant resisting the urge to fill the void with distraction or unhealthy coping mechanisms. It meant sitting with the discomfort and trusting that this season of my life had purpose even if it was not immediately visible. The ordinary nature of my strength made it easy for others to overlook, but I came to understand that invisibility did not diminish its value because my children felt it in the stability of their lives, in the safety of their routines, and in the consistency of my presence, and that was enough. I learned that strength does not always seek recognition. Sometimes it simply sustains, and while the world may not applaud the quiet endurance of a Black single father raising children with integrity, the impact of that endurance ripples outward, shaping lives and challenging assumptions without ever raising its voice. In the end, strength looked like getting up again and again, loving steadily, and choosing responsibility even when it was heavy, and that kind of strength may appear ordinary from the outside, but it is extraordinary in its persistence and transformative in its effect because it builds, lives quietly one day at a time, and leaves a legacy that does not need to be announced to be real. Life has a way of interrupting routines without asking permission, and it often does so at the exact moment you believe you finally understand the rhythm of your days. I had learned to live inside predictability because predictability felt safe. It was how I protected my children and myself from chaos. Every day followed a structure that I controlled as tightly as I could. Work, school, dinner, bedtime, repeat. I did not leave room for surprises because surprises had a history of costing me more than I could afford. That is why what happened caught me so completely off guard. The connection began in the most unremarkable way, through work. There was no spark, no hidden intention, no curiosity beyond professionalism. She was a senior leader, a CEO respected in rooms I was rarely invited into. I was reliable, quiet, consistent. Our paths crossed because of a project that demanded long hours and precise coordination. I treated her like I treated everyone else, with focus and respect and emotional distance, because my life did not have space for complications. I had children waiting at home and responsibilities that did not pause for possibility. The night everything changed did not feel important at first. A storm rolled in sudden and severe, shutting down roads and canceling travel plans. It was late. The project was unfinished. Hotels were full. Conversations turned practical. I offered what I could not because I was trying to impress, but because I knew what it meant to be stranded and tired and far from stability. It felt like the human thing to do. I did not think beyond that moment because I rarely did. Survival teaches you to stay present. That night passed without drama. There was conversation, but it stayed on safe ground. Work responsibilities, leadership challenges, parenting from different worlds but with similar weight. I noticed how carefully she listened. Not with curiosity that sought advantage, but with attention that felt grounded. Still, I did not read into it. I had trained myself not to. Reading into things is a luxury for people with margins. I went to sleep expecting to wake up to the same life I had always known. Morning came quietly, light through the window, the familiar sense of obligation waiting for me. I moved through the house in a half-awake state until I saw her. Standing there wearing my shirt as if it belonged to her, as if this moment made sense in a way I had not prepared for. My mind stalled, not from attraction or shock alone, but from the collision of two lives that were never supposed to intersect like this. Her world and mine had always felt separated by invisible rules, and now those rules had been crossed without ceremony. I froze because I did not know how to place this moment inside my understanding of myself. I had spent years shrinking my expectations to fit my circumstances. I did not imagine myself inside stories that involved powerful people or unexpected intimacy. Those stories belonged to other lives, other versions of men. Not to a black single father who measured success in clean laundry and calm evenings. Seeing her there disrupted the narrative I had built to survive. What unsettled me most was not the situation itself, but how normal it felt to her. There was no embarrassment, no performance, no need to explain. She moved through my space with ease and respect, as if she understood its importance. As if she saw my life not as temporary or chaotic, but as something stable and intentional. That recognition unsettled me more than judgment ever had, because it challenged the limits I had placed on myself. I realized in that moment how tightly I had confined my sense of possibility. I had done it to protect myself and my children. I had told myself that some worlds were not meant to overlap. That certain doors were closed not because I was incapable, but because opening them carried risk. But there she was standing in my kitchen, reminding me that life does not always respect the boundaries we draw out of fear. The surprise was not romantic in the way people imagine. It was existential. It forced me to confront how much of my identity had been shaped by caution. I had learned to move carefully to avoid disappointment. I had learned to manage expectations so thoroughly that I rarely allowed myself to imagine being chosen or seen beyond utility. This moment disrupted that discipline and left me exposed. I felt the urge to retreat, to restore order. To put everything back in its place. To return to the version of myself that knew exactly where he belonged. But something held me still. Perhaps it was exhaustion from carrying responsibility for so long. Perhaps it was curiosity. Or perhaps it was the quiet recognition that moments like this do not repeat themselves, and that turning away would mean denying a truth I had not yet named. She did not rush me. She did not fill the silence with explanation. She waited as if she understood that this was not about her position or power, but about the internal recalibration happening inside me. That patience mattered. It told me that this surprise was not an intrusion but an invitation. Not to romance or fantasy, but to reconsider the story I told myself about who I was allowed to be. Life surprises you not to entertain you, but to test the limits of your self-perception. That morning revealed how deeply I had internalized constraints that were never spoken aloud. It showed me how survival can quietly harden into self-denial if you are not careful. I had survived by narrowing my world. Now the world was asking if I was willing to widen it. I thought about my children and what they were learning from me. They saw a father who worked hard and showed up. But did they see a man who allowed himself dignity beyond duty? Did they see someone who believed he deserved respect without having to earn it through exhaustion? That question lingered as I stood there trying to decide how to move forward. The surprise did not give me answers. It gave me a mirror. It showed me the gap between how I lived and how I was perceived by someone who had no reason to flatter me. That gap was uncomfortable because it suggested that I had been underestimating myself, not out of humility but out of habit. When life surprises you like that, it is not asking you to abandon your responsibilities. It is asking you to integrate them into a fuller understanding of yourself. To see that being careful does not have to mean being small. To realize that stability and possibility can coexist. That morning did not change my life overnight. It changed my awareness. It reminded me that even carefully constructed routines can hold space for the unexpected. That identity is not fixed by circumstance alone. And that sometimes the most profound surprises arrive quietly and leave you standing still, not because you are afraid but because something inside you is waking up. I eventually moved forward, made coffee, spoke, returned to the flow of the day. But the stillness of that moment stayed with me. It marked the point where I realized that life could still surprise me and that perhaps I did not need to be afraid of that anymore. There are moments when words land with such precision that they seem to freeze time, and this was one of them because I had been preparing myself for questions, explanations, or assumptions, but what I received instead was truth spoken so plainly that my mind could not immediately find a place to hide from it. I stood there caught between the instinct to protect myself and the realization that what was being said was not an attack but an acknowledgement, and that difference mattered more than I could have imagined. She spoke without hesitation, not in the tone of someone asserting authority but in the calm certainty of someone naming what they see, and when she said she knew what people assumed about me and that she had believed those assumptions at first, it felt like the air shifted in the room because assumptions are usually left unspoken. They operate quietly, shaping interactions without ever being named, and hearing them acknowledged directly was unsettling but also strangely grounding because it brought something invisible into the light. Then she said she had been wrong and that admission carried more weight than praise ever could because it required reflection and humility from someone who was rarely required to question her own perceptions. She did not soften the statement or dress it in compliments. She simply stated it as fact, and that simplicity made it impossible to dismiss. It cut through years of accumulated doubt and landed squarely on the truth I had been living without recognition. When she talked about watching how I spoke about my children, how I managed pressure, and how I never asked for sympathy, something inside me tightened because those were things I rarely noticed in myself. They were not strategies, they were instincts born from necessity, and hearing them named forced me to see my own life through a lens I had not allowed myself to use, a lens that recognized integrity rather than survival. And that shift in perspective was disorienting because it challenged the story I had internalized about myself. Her words did not elevate me above anyone else, but they leveled the ground beneath my feet. They placed my character in the same category as traits that are universally respected, and that was unfamiliar territory for me because respect in my experience had always felt conditional, tied to performance, endurance, and restraint, but here it was being offered without requirements, and that generosity left me unsure how to respond. Then she said something that truly stopped me. She said, "Power does not impress me, character does." And in that moment I felt exposed, not because I was being judged but because I was being seen, and being seen without armor can be frightening when you have spent years protecting yourself from misunderstanding and dismissal. I had learned to anticipate skepticism from people in positions of influence and to brace myself accordingly, but this was different. There was no skepticism to push against, only recognition to absorb. The words settled slowly because they disrupted my expectations of how people like her viewed people like me. I had assumed that success insulated her from needing to look closely at anyone outside her world, but she had looked, and not in passing. She had paid attention, and that attention felt intimate in a way that had nothing to do with romance. It was the intimacy of being recognized as fully human rather than as a role or a stereotype. I realized then how rarely men like me are allowed complexity, how often we are reduced to fragments of narrative that make us easier to categorize and dismiss, and how deeply that reduction can shape the way we see ourselves over time. Hearing her name the full picture did something quiet but profound. It loosened the grip of those narratives and reminded me that they were never the whole truth. I stood there frozen because responding would have required me to catch up to the version of myself she was describing, and I was not ready to do that yet. I had lived too long inside a framework of self-assessment that prioritized caution over confidence and humility over acknowledgement, and her words asked me to expand that framework in real time, and that kind of expansion takes more than a moment to process. There was also fear in that stillness, fear of what it would mean to accept what she was saying, because acceptance would require responsibility to stop underestimating myself, responsibility to model a fuller sense of self-worth for my children, and responsibility to step into spaces with less apology and more presence, and that shift felt heavy even as it felt right. I noticed that she did not wait for reassurance, she did not look for validation of her statement. She said what she needed to say and allowed it to exist without negotiation, and that restraint made her words stronger because they were not dependent on my reaction, they were offered freely and left in my care to do with as I chose. That kind of truth has weight because it does not demand agreement, it invites reflection, and reflection is slower and deeper than reaction. As her words settled, I felt them reverberate against memories of moments when I had been overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed, and each memory reframed itself slightly, as if being held up to a new standard of understanding, not erased but reinterpreted in light of this recognition. I thought about how often I had been told to be grateful for small acknowledgments of effort as if they were gifts rather than expectations, and how her words bypassed that framework entirely. She did not commend me for managing despite my circumstances, she respected me for how I moved within them, and that distinction mattered because it centered agency rather than adversity. Being frozen in that moment was not paralysis, it was recalibration. It was the pause that happens when an internal compass adjusts and you need time to orient yourself again. I had been navigating by one set of coordinates for years, and suddenly another set had been introduced, and I needed to understand how they aligned. Her truth did not ask me to change who I was, it asked me to recognize who I already was, and that is often harder because it requires honesty rather than effort, and honesty can be confronting when it contradicts long-held beliefs about your own limitations. As the moment passed and conversation resumed, I carried that stillness with me, not as discomfort but as awareness. It became a reference point, a reminder that perception is not fixed and that being truly seen can arrive from unexpected places and alter your sense of self in lasting ways. I understood then that words can freeze you not because they threaten but because they reveal, and when they reveal something true they demand integration. They ask you to bring your self-image into alignment with reality, and that process takes time, patience, and courage. That morning her words became part of my internal dialogue. They echoed later when I questioned myself or minimized my value, and each time they did they nudged me toward a fuller understanding of my own worth, not inflated, not defensive but grounded and steady, and in that way the moment continued long after it ended, shaping how I moved through the world with a little less armor and a little more trust in who I was becoming. Being seen is not the same as being noticed, and I learned that difference in a way that settled deep into my bones because I had been noticed my entire life, noticed as a statistic, noticed as a concern, noticed as an exception, but rarely seen as a whole person with intention and dignity and complexity, and that absence of being seen had shaped how I carried myself through the world more than I realized until that moment when someone looked at me without projection and spoke from observation rather than assumption. For years I had moved through spaces aware of how I was perceived and adjusting myself accordingly. I learned when to speak and when to stay quiet, when to soften my presence and when to stand firm, not because I was inauthentic but because I understood the cost of being misunderstood, and that constant calibration takes energy. It fragments you because you are always negotiating which parts of yourself are safe to reveal and which must remain guarded, and over time that negotiation becomes second nature, so much so that you forget what it feels like to be fully present without armor. In that moment of being seen, something loosened, not dramatically but quietly, like a muscle releasing after being clenched for too long. I felt steadier, not elevated, and that steadiness came from recognition that did not require explanation or defense. She did not ask me to justify my life or narrate my struggles, she simply acknowledged what was already there, and that acknowledgement allowed me to exist without performance. What made it healing was the absence of pity. There was no tone of rescue, no implication that my life was admirable because it was hard, and no suggestion that I was exceptional for managing responsibilities that should never have been questioned in the first place. Her respect did not come from surprise, it came from clarity, and that distinction mattered because pity keeps you in a position of imbalance while respect places you on equal ground. I realized how rarely that equal ground had been offered to me, and how often I had internalized the need to earn it through exhaustion and restraint. Being seen in this way challenged that internal contract. It suggested that my worth was not conditional, and that realization was both comforting and unsettling because it required me to release the habits I had built around proving myself. The healing did not come from validation alone, it came from alignment between how I experienced my life and how it was reflected back to me for the first time. Those two perspectives matched, and that congruence restored something important: my trust in my own perception. I had spent so long questioning whether my efforts mattered, whether my values were visible, whether my quiet work had any meaning beyond survival, and in that moment the answer arrived without argument. I noticed how my body responded: shoulders lowered, breath deepened, thoughts slowed, because healing is not always cognitive. Sometimes it is physical. It is the body recognizing safety and allowing itself to rest, and that response surprised me because I did not realize how much tension I had been carrying simply from moving through a world that often misread me. Being seen also reshaped how I thought about leadership and power. I had associated power with distance, with control, with the ability to define others without being defined in return. But what I witnessed in that moment was a different expression of power, one that chose attention over assumption and humility over dominance, and seeing that modeled by someone in a position of authority expanded my understanding of what respect can look like when it is exercised responsibly. I began to reflect on how much of my life had been spent minimizing myself to avoid standing out in ways that might invite scrutiny, and how being seen made that minimization unnecessary. It gave me permission to occupy my space more fully, to speak without rehearsing, and to trust that my presence was not a problem to be managed. There was also grief in that realization, grief for the years I had spent believing I needed to be smaller, quieter, and less visible to be safe. Acknowledging that grief was part of the healing because it allowed me to honor the cost of that adaptation without shaming myself for it. I did what I needed to do to survive, and now I was being offered the opportunity to do more than survive. Being seen did not erase the challenges of my life. It did not make parenting easier or work lighter, but it changed the internal landscape in which those challenges existed. It replaced isolation with connection and self-doubt with self-recognition, and that internal shift altered how I approached everything that followed. I thought about my children and the example I was setting for them, and I realized that allowing myself to be seen with dignity was not just for me, it was for them too. They were watching how I accepted respect, how I responded to acknowledgement, and how I treated my own worth, and those lessons would shape how they understood themselves and their place in the world. There is a particular kind of healing that comes from being recognized by someone who owes you nothing and expects nothing in return. It strips away the suspicion that validation is transactional and leaves you with the understanding that respect can exist simply because it is deserved, and that understanding is deeply stabilizing. I carried that sense of being seen with me into subsequent interactions, not as confidence but as grounding. It reminded me that I did not need to explain my existence or justify my choices, and that reminder made me more present, more patient, and more open in ways I had not been before. The healing was subtle and ongoing. It showed up in small choices, in how I spoke to myself in moments of doubt, in how I allowed myself to rest without guilt, and in how I approached opportunities without immediately listing reasons I might not belong. Those changes were quiet but cumulative, and they reshaped my relationship with myself. Being seen is not about being admired, it is about being understood, and understanding allows you to move through the world with less resistance because you are no longer fighting against a misalignment between who you are and who you are allowed to be. That alignment is where healing takes root and grows. In the end, being seen did not change my circumstances, it changed my orientation to them. It allowed me to meet my life with steadiness rather than defensiveness, and with trust rather than fear, and that shift made all the difference, because healing does not always come from external change. Sometimes it comes from the internal permission to stand fully in your own truth and to let that be enough. The lesson did not arrive as a grand declaration or a sudden transformation. It unfolded slowly in the days that followed as I returned to my routines with a different awareness, quietly observing how that moment had altered the way I moved through the world. I realized that growth does not always announce itself. It often reveals itself through subtle shifts in posture, in patience, in the stories you tell yourself when no one else is listening. I began to notice how often I had been shrinking my presence, not out of humility but out of habit. I would enter rooms prepared to prove my worth before anyone questioned it, and I would leave conversations replaying what I said, searching for missteps that might justify doubt. This pattern had felt responsible, even necessary, but now it felt unnecessary and exhausting, and recognizing that was the first step toward letting it go. What changed was not my circumstances but my relationship to them. I still woke early, packed lunches, managed deadlines, and carried the weight of responsibility, but I did so with a steadier sense of self. I no longer felt like I was borrowing space or waiting for permission to belong. I understood that my life, my work, and my values were already legitimate without external validation, and that understanding grounded me in a way I had not known before. I started setting different boundaries, not louder ones but clearer ones. I became more intentional about where I placed my energy and whom I allowed to define my worth. I stopped over-explaining my choices and trusted that clarity did not require justification. This shift was quiet but powerful because it redirected my focus from managing perception to honoring integrity. There was also a change in how I spoke to my children. I realized that they were absorbing not just my words but my posture toward life. They noticed when I doubted myself and when I dismissed my own accomplishments, and they learned from those moments. Even when I thought I was shielding them, I began modeling something different, not bravado but assurance, not certainty but trust, and in doing so I offered them a blueprint for self-respect that felt more honest than any lecture. The experience taught me that dignity is not something bestowed by position or circumstance. It is something claimed through self-recognition, and once claimed, it reshapes how you engage with the world. You listen differently, you respond rather than react, and you choose actions that align with your values rather than your fears. This alignment creates a sense of coherence that steadies you even in uncertainty. I also learned that vulnerability does not always mean exposure. Sometimes it means allowing yourself to be affected by truth without rushing to protect yourself from it. The moment that froze me had done just that. It bypassed my defenses and invited me to integrate a fuller understanding of who I was. Accepting that invitation required courage, not because it asked me to risk rejection but because it asked me to release limitation. As time passed, I noticed opportunities I might have overlooked before, conversations I engaged more fully, ideas I shared without minimizing them, and decisions I made with confidence rather than hesitation. None of these changes were dramatic, but together they marked a shift from endurance to presence, from survival to participation. I reflected often on how many people move through life carrying invisible constraints formed by past experiences and unspoken expectations, and how those constraints shape behavior long after they are necessary. My experience reminded me that growth often begins with questioning which constraints still serve us and which have become habits that limit possibility. The lesson extended beyond my own life. It influenced how I saw others. I became more attentive, more curious, and less quick to assume, because I understood how powerful it is to be truly seen and how damaging it can be to be misread. This awareness fostered empathy and patience, and it improved my relationships in ways I had not anticipated. I also recognized the importance of gratitude, not as obligation but as acknowledgement. I was grateful for the moment, not because it was flattering but because it was clarifying. It revealed a truth I needed to hear, and it arrived at a time when I was ready to receive it. That convergence felt meaningful, and I honored it by letting it inform my choices. The final lesson was about possibility, not in the sense of ambition or upward movement but in the sense of openness. I learned that life does not stop offering new understandings of self simply because routines are established or responsibilities are heavy. There is always room for growth if you are willing to pay attention. I carried that openness forward, knowing that surprises may still unsettle me, but they no longer threaten my sense of self. I trust my values, my intentions, and my capacity to adapt. This trust allows me to meet the unknown with curiosity rather than fear, and that orientation makes all the difference. In the end, the experience did not redefine who I was, it clarified who I had always been, and clarity is a powerful thing. It removes doubt without inflating ego, and it grounds confidence in truth rather than comparison. Living from that place feels sustainable and real, and it supports a life built not on reaction but on intention. That is the lesson I hold on to, that dignity begins within, that being seen can awaken self-recognition, and that growth often arrives quietly, asking only that you listen and respond with honesty and courage. And when you do, your life does not become easier but it becomes more aligned, and alignment brings a peace that is steady and enduring.